It's almost as if it was planned, isn't it? If you need proof of how corrupt political discourse is in this country, you just heard it in that last bulletin, where correctly our newsreader reflects upon the fact that some people are calling Keir Starmer never hear Keir, without mentioning that the reason why he is compelled to make so many foreign trips is to try to repair much of the damage done to our international reputation right across the globe, not just in Europe, by previous administrations which the people who would use a phrase like never hear Keir or Boris derangement syndrome or Trump derangement syndrome or Brexit derangement syndrome, they all told you that all of those things would be absolutely brilliant. And now as Keir Starmer, who, as we discussed yesterday, is impressing very, very few people, but as Keir Starmer tries to undo the epic damage done to our international reputation by becoming the first population in history to vote to impose economic sanctions on itself, by comparing allies to concentration camp guards in the case of Boris Johnson, by pursuing xenophobic rhetoric to a point where even people previously comfortable with a little bit of light 1970s racism felt their blood curdling. And the bloke charged with trying to undo all of that damage also gets a shoeing and a kicking for trying to undo some of that damage by the people who caused it. Welcome to Brexit Britain in 2025. What would you do today if you were me and you'd spent years championing Boris Johnson? What would you do today if you were a newspaper editor or a newspaper columnist, a broadcaster or a pundit, even perhaps an online influencer, who had been a fully paid-up member of the Boris Johnson fan club? Even perhaps a side order of Dominic Cummings' hero worship. Oh, he's so clever. Oh, 5D chess. He's such a genius. What would you do today? Daily Mail provides a little bit of guidance on that. They report upon the Hallett inquiry without mentioning the fact that they're currently paying the man responsible, arguably, for 23,000 unnecessary deaths, hundreds of thousands of pounds a year to write a weekly pile of bilge for them. They've also got Nadine Dorries on the payroll, the sort of handmaiden to Boris Johnson, all of whom will carry precisely no consequences, will carry no can whatsoever. If they have a conscience, that is the only punishment they will face for treating the British population with a curious combination of contempt and disinterest. 5 Cobra meetings missed because reasons. Oh, he's Boris. Oh, he's so funny. He was probably, I don't know, 5 Cobra meetings missed. What do you think of first? What do you think of first? Italy, right? Not just the pictures, but the voices, the calls we took from Italy, telling us in no uncertain terms that these overflowing hospitals were a harbinger of what we were about to face. I mean, what on earth is the question that we begin with today? How on earth did anybody convince themselves that we would somehow be exempt from the horrors visited upon Italy by dint of what? Our special sovereignty? Our box fresh Brexit brilliance? The leadership of Boris Johnson? Remember the footage from Italy and the incredibly draconian measures that were introduced almost immediately as the bodies pretty much did start piling up. And the sense in this country that the people in charge, the people at the top of the pyramid, were supremely and extraordinarily incompetent and inadequate. And I know the answer to the question, what would you do? What would I do? What would you do if you'd had this job and you'd spent years plugging Boris Johnson? Forget about Brexit today. I mean, that's, again, something that you're only going to have to answer to your conscience to, because the British media is never going to make people own the consequences of their dishonesty and idiocy. But what would you do if you'd done it? If you'd say, oh, Boris Johnson's great. Boris Johnson's wonderful. Oh, he's such a good bloke. Oh, he's so much fun. He's on the show tomorrow, going to tickle his toes. Oh, I love him. He's so great. He's so funny. He's so great. He's so funny. Glad he's in charge. He's like a Churchill, isn't he? Oh, yes, he's like a Winston Churchill. He's like a Winston Churchill de nos jours. And yet the rest of the country could see that this was like having, a tufted blancmange in charge of the most complicated public policy period that the country had faced since the Second World War. I don't know that the gulf between citizens, fellow citizens, friends, family members, colleagues, I don't know that it was ever bigger than with Boris Johnson. The idea that he was anything other than a sexually incontinent serial liar whose interest lay in precisely nothing but his own self-advancement, status and narcissism. A statement of facts, a series of observations so crystal clear to most of us that you could see them from space. And yet to others, including people who are still in receipt of very large salaries for their political insights and their opinions and their hilarious castigations of politicians who try their hardest to operate within the parameters of truth, still drawing down huge salaries, telling us at the time that he was a top bloke, that he was the perfect man for the job, that he was going to have his own sort of D-Day as we've tried to see off this global pandemic. And then Cummings. A man so entirely of a piece with everything that's gone wrong in this country in recent decades that it's quite possible his face will appear on the front of history books in the future. Everything from the shilling for secretly funded think tanks and going after the traditional targets of the BBC or the liberals or people who don't like racism, whatever it might be, or Brussels, God damn it, Brussels, all of those things. And then cloaking himself in this air of, I don't know what you'd call it, diabolical genius, when in fact he has the brains of a Rizzler paper. Just the ego of a Roman emperor. And he, of course, greased Boris Johnson's passage into Downing Street by peddling all sorts of nonsenses, embellishments and untruths to your family on Facebook, to you quite possibly on Facebook, because it was the Brexit wave that carried those two sociopaths all the way to Downing Street, where they found themselves in charge at a time of unprecedented national peril. Peril that was also visible from space, or at least from London, because the consequences of not responding properly, not recognising the threat immediately and not dealing with it well, was visible in Italy. And here we are. Do you remember people telling you that he got all the big calls right? I'm a little bit more emotional than I expected this morning for reasons that I'll share with you in a moment. Do you remember that? We should make a list of the people who said he got all the big calls right. We should carve it in stone and stick it in Trafalgar Square alongside a memorial to the 23,000 people who would quite possibly still be with us today if Boris Johnson had never become Prime Minister. He got all the big calls right. He got pretty much nothing right. Calling lockdowns when he had absolutely no choice but to do so. Baroness Hallett revealing yesterday, of course, that had they moved even a week earlier, it's possible they could have been avoided altogether. But doing nothing until his hand was forced. How many times did we sit here together and talk about how he will do nothing until he has no choice? He is so incapable of making a decision that is not defined by what is best for him. You give him a choice between two bad things. There's not a choice that gives him a 24-hour win in a news cycle. There's not a choice that gives him a brief fillip to his self-regard or his public image. If he's left with a choice between a rock and a hard place, he can't make it. He has no judgment. He has no integrity. He has no ability to prioritise the welfare of the population above the welfare of his own short-term political fortunes. So he couldn't make a decision about anything until it was made for him by events. In this case, events that involved deaths, avoidable deaths, of British people, of our friends, our family members, our colleagues. Remember, we talked about that. The other thing we talked about, and I don't know if I'm ashamed of this. I don't know if I'm ashamed of this or not, because I don't know that we could have done it any differently. I remember telling you that I just couldn't shake this notion that they knew something we didn't know. Do you remember on the days when the incompetence and the inadequacy seemed to be absolutely epic, you kind of had this notion that, well, they're in charge. It can't be as bad as it looks. They must know something that we don't know. Most obviously, with the Italian example, you'd sort of think, well, no, they must know something that means that we are not, somehow we're not exposed to the same risks that Italy was exposed to. We must be somehow different. Is that a form of exceptionalism? I hope not. I think it's just misplaced trust. You can't end up Prime Minister in this country if you're all the things that I thought Boris Johnson was. We're just better than that. Coming 3 years after Brexit, you'd have thought we all realised that the British population can be persuaded to smash itself in the face with a frying pan at 10 o'clock every morning, on cue. We put Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings in charge of our country. And then even those of us who were screaming from the rafters about how it was bound to end in disaster sat there thinking they must know something we don't know. Because there's no earthly way that sentient human beings observing the evidence that we were observing and talking about on the radio every day with no special insights except our shared time together and a quite unprecedented plurality of perspectives, we could sit here observing, describing, sharing evidence, stories, facts, and yet still cling to the notion that they must know something we don't know. They must be seeing something we can't see because of the decisions that they're making and the things that they're doing. Even the parties. Even when Boris Johnson's mates were puking up in Downing Street and trying to get off with each other and playing on swings and laughing at the public and sending colleagues to Tesco's with suitcases to fill them up with booze and wheel them back into the seat of power in this country while you were barely allowed to attend your own grandmother's funeral. Even then, I sometimes thought, well, they must know something I don't know. They must have made us like belt and braces. The reason why I had to bury my friend without anybody being in the room with him must be because they know something we don't know. They must know something we don't know. And it turns out they knew nothing. They had nothing. No insights. You know what they were sustained by? I sometimes worry about being a stuck record. But they were sustained by the deeply corrupt and dishonest people in this country who call themselves journalists. He got all the big calls right. And how do they avoid responsibility for their own tragic failure on a day like today? They claim that the inquiry wasn't necessary, or they make lies about it, proving what they said all along. The Daily Telegraph, and you know my late father worked for the Telegraph when it actually deserved to be called a newspaper. So I think that perhaps is why I'm so dismayed by its absolute capitulation to cronyism and dishonesty. The Daily Telegraph says, the inquiry tells us what we already know. Lockdown was not necessary. What a wonderful standfast that is. How completely it ignores the fact that what Baroness Hallett found was that if we had had decent leadership that acted much sooner, then it's possible we could have avoided lockdowns which were rendered necessary by a man who used to be paid a king's ransom to write a weekly pile of bilge for, yeah, you guessed it, the Daily Telegraph. Senior members of whose staff gathered with Boris Johnson to try to save Owen Patterson's career after he was found to have broken parliamentary standards. People like Boris Johnson and his mates at the Daily Telegraph don't respond to rule breaking by one of their cronies by saying sorry, moving on, and perhaps offering a word of quiet support to their disgraced colleague. They try to burn the rule book. They try to rip up the rules when one of their own is caught. And that's the approach they took to COVID. Short-term, opportunist, self-serving, narcissistic, psychopathic, whatever adjective you prefer. Those were the watchwords for this administration, for this regime. I'm not even going to open Idiot's Corner today. He did his best in difficult circumstances. Mate, you're brainwashed. You're gaslit. You're barely worth the intellectual effort of counting your brain cells. He was an unmitigated, borderline murderous disaster. His incompetence, his ignorance, his arrogance, his insouciance, his contempt for ordinary people, his abject disinterest in anything other than his own self-advancement is not news. Daily Telegraph says they tell us what we already know. Yeah, you're right. The bloke you were championing, the bloke you described as getting all the big calls, right? The bloke whose toes you've been tickling for 20 or 30 years, the bloke who in many ways you set upon a course to Downing Street, should never have been allowed anywhere near power. And you put him there. Tells us what we already know. Lockdowns were not necessary. How do you sleep straight in bed at night if you're publishing poison like that? Revisionism. Appalling rewriting of observable facts.